For decades, Elton John has been one of the most flamboyant, outspoken, and celebrated figures in music history. Behind the glittering costumes, chart-topping hits, and sold-out arenas, however, lies a man who has never been afraid to speak his mind about his friends, his rivals, and even those he could never forgive. Known for his fiery temper and sharp tongue, Elton has had his share of public feuds over the years, but there was one person who stood out above all the rest. This wasn't just another disagreement between celebrities. It was a clash of personalities so intense that it became part of rock and roll legend. Elton John has often admitted that he's quick to anger but equally quick to forgive. Yet in this particular case, forgiveness never came. The animosity lingered for decades, spilling into interviews, concerts, and even tabloid headlines. Fans were left stunned as Elton's usually witty jabs turned into outright hostility whenever this person's name came up. But what could possibly drive one of the most successful and beloved musicians in history to hold on to so much resentment? Was it jealousy, betrayal, or something far more personal? The answer reveals not just a feud, but a window into Elton's struggles with fame, ego, and trust in an industry where competition can turn into lifelong bitterness. Today, we're diving deep into the story of the one man Elton John truly hated more than anyone, exploring the roots of their conflict, the moments when tensions reached their peak, and why, even after years of success, Elton could never let go. By the early 1970s, Elton John had skyrocketed into one of the biggest stars in the world. With hits like Your Song, Rocket Man, and Tiny Dancer, he wasn't just topping the charts, he was rewriting what it meant to be a global pop icon. His concerts were flamboyant spectacles with glittering outfits, oversized glasses, and a level of theatricality that few had ever dared to bring to rock music. Beneath all the glitz, however, Elton was a deeply competitive artist. He thrived on being the best, selling more records than anyone else, and proving to critics that he was more than just a showman. But competition in the music world is fierce. And for every artist who cheered Elton's success, there were others who resented it, or even clashed with him directly. Among them was one man whose personality and career path collided with Elton's in ways that seemed destined for hostility. Their feud would go on to define some of the most turbulent years of Elton's career. The roots of the conflict can be traced to more than just professional rivalry. Elton John was known for being outspoken, sometimes brutally so when it came to giving his opinion. He never hesitated to call out what he thought was mediocrity or dishonesty in the music industry. That honesty, while refreshing to his fans, often put him at odds with other musicians who weren't prepared to hear his harsh critiques. This was especially true with the man Elton grew to despise most. To Elton, he represented everything wrong with the industry: arrogance, insincerity, and a talent for self-promotion that seemed to overshadow genuine artistry. The more their paths crossed, whether at award shows, in the press, or behind the scenes, the more their dislike for one another grew. For Elton, who valued authenticity above all else, this person became a symbol of the kind of shallow celebrity culture he couldn't stand. And for the other man, Elton's cutting remarks and biting humor only fueled resentment in return. The feud became so intense that it wasn't just whispered about. It became a topic of open discussion in magazines, interviews, and even television appearances. At the same time, Elton was battling his own demons. Fame had brought him incredible wealth and status, but also immense pressure. Behind closed doors, he struggled with addiction, loneliness, and the weight of constant scrutiny. These personal battles made him more volatile and less willing to tolerate people he didn't respect. When this rival came into the picture, it was the perfect storm. Elton's sharp temper meeting someone who thrived on pushing his buttons. As the 1970s turned into the 1980s, the feud only grew hotter. Fans and reporters speculated endlessly about their animosity, and Elton himself seemed to confirm it whenever he was asked. "I don't like him, and I never will," Elton once said bluntly in an interview, a rare admission for an artist who usually knew when to hold his tongue. This was no passing squabble. This was the beginning of a rift that would last for decades. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Elton John's career was at full throttle, and his feud with this unnamed rival had started spilling into the public eye. No longer just whispered about in recording studios or hinted at in industry gossip, the tension had become impossible to hide. Interviews, awards ceremonies, and even live performances became arenas where their animosity played out for the world to see. The first major clash happened during an award season where both men were nominated for top honors. Elton, never one to mask his emotions, made no attempt to hide his disdain when asked about his competitor. With his trademark wit sharpened to a razor's edge, he dismissed him as style without substance. For Elton, whose career was built on emotional songwriting and raw talent, the idea that someone could succeed on hype and image alone was infuriating. The comment made headlines across Britain and the United States, turning their private dislike into a very public feud. But it didn't stop there. Tabloids thrived on the back and forth between them. Each new jab, each sarcastic remark became fodder for gossip columns. Elton, who was never shy about expressing his feelings, sometimes went out of his way to mock his rival on stage. At certain concerts, he would throw in quick, unscripted digs that fans immediately recognized as thinly veiled insults. The crowd would laugh, but insiders knew these were not jokes. They were barbs aimed straight at the man Elton loathed. In return, the rival wasn't silent either. Interviews surfaced in which he painted Elton as a diva, someone obsessed with costumes and spectacle rather than serious music. The irony, of course, was that this was the very criticism Elton had directed at him. It was a war of mirrors, each accusing the other of being shallow, arrogant, or out of touch. One particularly notorious incident occurred backstage at a major charity concert. Both were scheduled to perform, and organizers had tried to keep them apart. But inevitably, paths crossed. Witnesses described the encounter as icy, with Elton offering nothing more than a cold stare and his rival firing back with a sarcastic comment. Security and handlers quickly moved them apart, but the story leaked almost instantly, feeding the narrative that theirs was one of the bitterest feuds in show business. What made this rivalry especially explosive was Elton's personality. He was not just any star, he was someone who had built a reputation for saying exactly what he thought, no matter how shocking it might be. Where other celebrities might have stayed silent or played the media game, Elton doubled down, almost enjoying the controversy. He understood that his fans loved his honesty, even if it ruffled feathers. Still, there was more at play than just showbiz drama. Behind Elton's pointed words was a deep frustration with the way the music industry seemed to reward spectacle over sincerity. To him, his rival wasn't just another singer or performer. He represented an entire culture that Elton despised. And so, every public exchange became more than personal. It was symbolic of Elton's fight to protect what he believed real music should be. By the mid-1980s, their feud had become a permanent fixture in the media. It was no longer just a rivalry, it was a battle that defined part of Elton's public persona. And while some fans hoped they might reconcile, those close to Elton insisted it was impossible. For him, this was not a grudge to be forgiven, it was a matter of principle. By the time Elton John's feud with his rival reached its peak in the 1980s, the animosity was doing more than just entertaining tabloids. It was starting to weigh on Elton himself. For a man who poured so much of his heart and soul into his music, living with a constant undercurrent of anger was exhausting. And while Elton could play up the feud with sharp comments and playful digs on stage, behind closed doors, it cut much deeper. Part of the strain came from timing. The 1980s were a difficult period in Elton's personal life. His fame had reached astronomical levels, but so had the pressure. He was struggling with identity, battling substance abuse, and privately wrestling with the loneliness that often comes with international stardom. His rival's constant presence in the industry, combined with their public spats, only heightened Elton's inner turmoil. Every magazine headline, every award nomination, every interview where the man's name came up acted like fuel on an already roaring fire. Friends who were close to Elton during this period later said that his hatred was more than just about one man. It was about everything that came with him. To Elton, this rival symbolized hypocrisy in the music world, fame without artistry, celebrity without depth. And for someone like Elton, who had worked tirelessly to prove that his flamboyant image was backed by real talent, the comparison was infuriating. It wasn't simply dislike. It was resentment rooted in fear that his own authenticity was being overshadowed by someone he believed didn't deserve their platform. The toll showed up in his behavior. Elton was known for his legendary temper, often exploding at friends, colleagues, and even strangers when something set him off. Many of those closest to him admitted that the feud seemed to haunt him. One of the rare times when he couldn't just laugh something off. His rival lived in his head rent-free, and Elton's inability to let it go became part of his emotional burden. Addiction made everything worse. In moments of anger or despair, Elton would turn to substances as an escape. This only intensified his bitterness, creating a cycle in which the feud was both a distraction and a trigger. His anger at his rival wasn't the only cause of his struggles, of course, but it became tied up in the larger web of pain, loneliness, and self-doubt that defined much of Elton's private life during that era. It's telling that in later years, Elton admitted he often burned bridges without thinking of the consequences. He once said, "I have a tendency to cut people off if I feel betrayed, and I never look back." This philosophy made reconciliation nearly impossible. Once he decided that this rival represented everything he despised, there was no going back. His hatred became fixed, unshakable, almost like a scar he carried with him. Yet, in an ironic way, the feud also motivated him. Elton's drive to outshine his rival, to prove, time and again, that his artistry was superior, pushed him to create some of his most enduring work. Songs like "I'm Still Standing" weren't just anthems for fans. They were declarations of survival, resilience, and triumph over adversity. For Elton, every record sold, every stadium filled, was proof that authenticity could still win in a world obsessed with image. But while the music soared, Elton himself remained haunted. He couldn't forgive and he wouldn't forget, and that refusal left an undeniable mark on his life, one that would follow him well into his later years. As Elton John moved into the later stages of his career, his life began to transform in profound ways. He overcame his addictions, embraced his identity, and found stability in family life with his husband David Furnish and their children. Professionally, he continued to thrive, filling stadiums around the world, winning Oscars, and even being knighted by the Queen. On the surface, Elton seemed to have finally reached a place of peace, but when asked about the rival he had clashed with for decades, Elton's tone often shifted. The sharpness never quite left his voice. Even in interviews conducted well into the 2000s, when Elton had mellowed in so many areas of his life, his words about this man were laced with bitterness. Unlike many of his earlier feuds, where he had reconciled with former enemies or laughed off past disagreements, this one remained unresolved. It was as though Elton simply could not forgive, no matter how much time had passed. Why was this grudge so enduring? For Elton, it seemed personal in a way that went beyond the music charts or public perception. This rival represented not just a professional annoyance, but a betrayal of what Elton believed music should stand for. Elton had always prided himself on being authentic, emotional, and genuine, even when he was at his most flamboyant. In contrast, he viewed his rival as someone who thrived on spectacle and ego without offering much substance. It wasn't simply a dislike, it was a moral judgment. Fans and journalists often speculated whether Elton might eventually soften, as he had with others. After all, he famously patched things up with musicians he had once insulted or sparred with. But this feud was different. It became part of Elton's narrative, a reminder that even someone as open-hearted as him could hold on to pain when the wound cut deep enough. What's most striking is how the feud shaped Elton's own sense of legacy. By holding this rival up as the ultimate example of what he despised, Elton clarified what he wanted his own career to stand for. Where his rival leaned on controversy, Elton wanted his songs to speak for themselves. Where his rival embodied arrogance, Elton hoped to balance flamboyance with sincerity. Their opposition wasn't just about personality, it was about philosophy. in the grand scheme of Elton's career. This hatred is a footnote compared to the music, the philanthropy, and the sheer impact he has had on popular culture. Yet it lingers, a reminder that even the most successful, beloved figures carry scars from battles we may never fully understand. For Elton, this one rivalry stood apart because it tapped into his deepest insecurities, his fiercest convictions, and his most vulnerable years. As Elton now reflects on his extraordinary life, retiring from touring and enjoying time with his family, the world continues to celebrate him for his brilliance. The feud may always be remembered by fans and journalists, but to Elton, it remained something he never wanted to forgive or forget. And so, in the story of one of music's greatest icons, this chapter stands as proof that even amidst glittering success, there can be shadows. For Elton John, the man he truly hated more than anyone was not just a rival. He was a symbol of everything Elton fought against. And perhaps that's why, even after all these years, the bitterness has never entirely